Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, "You are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power."
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for our agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you loyal listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now through this latest season of Fund Drive. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, July 25th, 2026. We begin with our very own treasure trove of wisdom, author, historian, and professor of African American Studies at the University of Houston, and Freedom Now co-producer, Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined first on the line by Laura Hooton, assistant professor of history at New Mexico State University, and author of the book, Little Liberia, A Dream of Black Freedom in the US-Mexico Borderlands. After that, in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be in conversation with Karen Stanford, professor of political science at the Department of Africana Studies at California State University at Northridge. For our purposes today, Professor Stanford is co-author of the book Marching West, the LA Civil Rights Movement in Photographs. It is yet another packed hour of knowledge you can only get right here at KPFK 90.7 FM. So with that, let's hear from KPFK's very own Gary Baca about why you should support us here at Freedom Now and KPFK.
Yes, you are listening to Freedom Now on KPFK 90.7 FM Los Angeles. Freedom Now, a Pan-African Internationalist World Affairs program that covers global struggles, features a jazz spotlight, and broadcasts an African drumbeat historical calendar. It's co-produced by Dr. Gerald Horne, and we got to give a big shout out to Brandon and Tej for keeping this show together. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. The real treasure here is KPFK, that we stay on the air and keep shows like Freedom Now on the airwaves. We're asking you to go and pick up your phone and hit 818-985-5735. Pledge your support that shows like this continue to be on the KPFK airwaves. Pledge for the people that cannot pledge. How about those folks on a budget? How about those folks on lockdown? You can pledge for them. And right now we're going to hopefully be able to get a call in, a $200 pledge, a $300 pledge, and maybe we can match some other Freedom Now listener. And if we can get that $300, we can see if we could match that. And that would be $600 for Freedom Now. 818-985-5735. Call the phone room and ask them what we have. Tote bag, t-shirts at a $50 donation. But what's more important, you keep KPFK on the air by keeping the lights on and the transmitter. We are listener sponsored, so we depend upon listeners like you to come through and help us out. We have to continue the work to understand the history of America and where we stand and who we are as people. 818-985-5735. Let's keep those phones ringing. We really need a call right now. We don't have anyone on the phone, and we're asking you to be that person that steps up and goes to the phone and pledge your support for this program. We've been around since 1959, and that's because the people in the 60s and the 70s appreciated what was going on. We were covering the war in Vietnam. We were on the air with Nixon, Bush, Clinton, Obama, and yeah, you know who I'm talking about, the orange one. 818-985-5735, and we talked about it. And that's what the conversations are about. So if you believe in free speech, call now and pledge your support at any level. We need that $500 angel, that $1,000 angel that supports public radio, independent news and views. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. Call now and pledge your support for Freedom Now.
Now that you have decided to make your pledge, I want to remind you that I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now. KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure we stay on the smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring WizKid, Ernie Watts, Abdullah Ibrahim, Clifford Brown, Kenny Clark, and Horace Silver. Now, people, get ready for this train to come and taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for this interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Professor Laura Hooton.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Laura Hooton, Assistant Professor of History at New Mexico State University and author of the book Little Liberia, A Dream of Black Freedom in the US-Mexico Borderlands. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Laura Hooton.
Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us. So, what is Little Liberia? Where is Little Liberia? What was the time frame in your story for the construction of Black freedom? And what happened to Little Liberia?
So Little Liberia was, I call it a trans-border Black activist community because it really was on both sides of the US-Mexico border. They had locations in California, Baja California, and Oklahoma, as well as other kind of satellites around the United States. And it started off as a agricultural community. And the goal was to change kind of racial dynamics in the US through growing a highly successful Black business just across the border in Baja California. As time went on and the US and the world evolved, so did the movement. They expanded their business opportunities. They looked into tourism as well as business opportunities that were also a little more activist. So things like creating a sanatorium to treat tuberculosis, a Black and Mexican co-owned bank. They looked into all these different opportunities. And they also, post 1921, shifted to being much more explicitly anti-white supremacist, although they always were. And they created a sister organization called the International Community Welfare League that was explicitly kind of geared toward connecting Indigenous, Black, and Mexican descent folks across the continent to challenge white supremacy.
So this welfare league, Talk more about that.
Sure. So early on, the movement was very explicitly business, and like I said, explicitly agriculture, and really looking at wheat, because wheat was a really important product in World War I. And they were talking a lot about how they wanted to provide for the war effort, because the war effort was so important for changing ideas of freedom at home as well as abroad. After the war, really with, if you look at the, not just the Tulsa Race Massacre, but also all of the race riots that happened in 1919 and 1920, it was very clear to a lot of African Americans that not only had things not changed because of the war, but in some cases were regressing. And so you have a pretty significant group of wealthy individuals from northeastern Oklahoma in and around Black Wall Street who, after the Tulsa Massacre, get involved in the community and get into positions of power. And I suspect they're the ones who really spearheaded the League. And the International Community Welfare League had offices in Oklahoma, specifically northeastern Oklahoma, in Los Angeles and other parts of Southern California, in Mexico City, and in Baja California. And they talked about kind of a wide range of things. They talked about educating the public about white supremacy, including white folks, to try to kind of take that base of support away from the KKK. They talked about the impact of white supremacy in both the US and Mexico. And they really thought that Black, brown, and indigenous folks should all come together, first of all, to care for each other, to be there for each other, and also to support each other in these movements, and that they were stronger if they were all together.
Now, Little Liberia and the Welfare League, were they driven out of existence, or did it simply wither on the vine?
A little of both and a bunch of other things. So it's worth noting that throughout the life of the community, it was mostly middle and upper class African Americans who were leading it, even though they did have a bunch of other folks, class and race-based, who were involved. That was the main core group. And one of them, there's in 1927, 1928 especially, when the community really, for the most part, fell, there's a lot of information that's pretty sensational. And so sometimes it's kind of hard to tell actually what fully happened, but it looks like the community had a lot of financial issues. It looks like the board had made some pretty poor business decisions, had kind of said yes to everything that was brought to them, whether or not it was sustainable. On top of that, there were droughts in northern Baja California that were pretty bad in the first couple years, and it looks like they might have had a hard time kind of recovering from that. Also, there were a lot of political changes in Mexico that really impacted them. And on top of that, there were at least one, if not more than one, members of the board of directors who might have mishandled money. It's unclear if they took the money illegally or not, but there was a lot of money that went missing. And so there was an audit that happened. And when that audit came to light, the board started infighting. There were all these newspaper articles between the board members attacking each other. Simultaneously, the businesses is having troubles. And at the same time, there were changes in Mexican politics and in especially the president of Mexico, and some anti-Black immigration laws that explicitly kind of made it harder for them to recruit. So it's kind of external and internal factors and everything happening kind of all at once.
Now, for those who may not be geographically astute, was their base in Baja California adjacent to San Diego County or further south?
A little further south. It depends on, I guess, what you think of as adjacent. It's closest to Ensenada. So part of the focus of the community was selling goods back to the US and especially back to California, because there were railroads that connected a lot of the areas along the border. and because they were so close to San Diego. To give you an idea, it was 40 miles outside of Ensenada, kind of north and east. It was roughly 180 miles south of LA County.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So for the time frame, not the quickest traveling, but there were a lot of folks in the community who had cars. Cars were starting to be more popular, and there were also significant, not just railroad, but boating routes that went to that part of Baja California from both Los Angeles and San Diego.
A slight digression, Laura Hooton.
Sure.
Are you related to the former famous LA Dodger curveballer, Burt Hooton, and his notorious knuckle curve?
I wish. From what I've heard from Hooton's my married name, and I did grow up listening to a lot of Dodger baseball. I really miss Vin Scully, but I think we all do. But unfortunately, I don't think we're related.
Okay. What about Black Angelenos? Could you talk about their role specifically?
Sure. Well, a very, very well-known Black Angeleno that I'm sure some of your listeners have heard of, Charlotta Bass, was connected to the community. A lot of my sourcing is from the California Eagle, from when she was editing the paper, and I'm sure she wrote some of the articles. She did own some stock in the company and was friends with a lot of folks in the community. And there's quite a few others well-known, at least within very certain Black history circles, Black Angelenos involved in the community. And really, it is middle upper class Black Angelenos who start the project and really envision this alternative possibility for not only Black excellence and growing a Black business, but also for social change in the US. And in the West, a big name with the community is Hugh Macbeth. He's actually one of the folks that was involved with some of the financial challenges. He was a well-known lawyer in the area, and he's actually well-known in Asian American history circles too, because he was a lawyer, and he was the first lawyer, I believe, to sue the US government around Japanese internment, which is why there's actually materials for him up at Manzanar. And actually there's a lot of folks in the community who had, before this community even started, had a background in kind of multiracial or transracial activism. Another gentleman, James Littlejohn, who I highlight a lot in the book, grew up and lived in a bunch of different places, including Guatemala. He worked on the Guatemala Railroad. He spoke Spanish, and he actually ended up living in the Little Liberia and Ensenada area pretty much the rest of his life. And actually Ebony magazine in the mid-50s did a multi-page spread on him and his wife, Elizabeth, and talked about the two of them because he had been named Citizen of the Year in Ensenada. So he started out in LA, but ended up permanently moving to Baja California.
What about,
and there's more. I could go on and on. There's tons of really awesome people that I get to talk about in the project.
Oh, go on. I don't want to interrupt you.
So the president of the community was named Theodore Troy, and his whole family got involved. He had siblings as well as children, and his spouse and their spouses all got involved in the community. He was president for the early years. He then had to step down for a few years because of health issues, went back to Los Angeles for a bit, but then ended up back down in Baja California toward the ending years. And actually quite a few members of his family did a lot for the community. And Charlotta Bass actually talks about him in her memoirs and really praises him for all the work that he did in Los Angeles. So he's another person who is kind of one of those unsung heroes in Black LA, especially in the early 20th century, that I'm happy to be able to talk about in the book.
What about connections to the Mexican Revolutionary period, 1910 to 1920, particularly since you've already alluded to the fact that regime changes in Mexico City impacted Little Liberia?
Yeah, it's an interesting intersection. I like to talk about the Little Liberia story as both a US and a Mexico story, and at a time where both countries have a lot of change, because there's a lot going on between the US and Mexico and independently from one another. And the Mexican Revolution is the big piece on the Mexican side. It's interesting in Baja California because Baja California is, except for one specific instance early on in the revolution, is really peripheral to a lot of it. And Baja California isn't a state at that point. There's a lot of questions on what role it's going to play in the future for Mexico. Some areas are seen as possibly powerhouses for agriculture, but not quite yet. And so the governor of Baja California, Esteban Cantu, early on, they make friends with him and he is very favorable to the community. And then he gets exiled to Los Angeles because there is some evidence that he was trying to amass an army to take over the federal government. And so he gets removed from power, partially because of the Mexican Revolution. That's his kind of play for power in the revolution. It's a lot more complicated, but that's the general gist. And so when he gets exiled, the government in Baja California, the regional government, is pretty chaotic for quite a few years. There's a lot of different governors. There's a lot of turnover. And so the Little Liberia leaders turn to Mexico City and the federal government, and they actually have meetings with Alvaro Obregón, who's one of the Sonoran Triangle, one of these major leaders during the Mexican Revolution. And he is very favorable to this movement. He's very favorable to African Americans coming to Mexico. And actually they get involved in a very sticky situation between President Obregón and the US government. One of the big key pieces of the Mexican Revolution has to do with land ownership. There's a lot of American businesses and wealthy Americans and foreigners in general who own land in Mexico. And part of the reason that Mexicans were very unhappy, to put it lightly, with Porfirio Diaz, who was president when the revolution started, was because of land issues and because he had allowed so many foreigners to own land. So when Little Liberia came in, they're coming in as foreigners during a time where a main critique of a revolution that's happening is foreign land ownership. So they were very careful with who they talked to and finding this connection. They had to buy the land a very specific way, and actually they didn't quite do it right, which is part of the end of the community as well. But when they went to talk to Obregón, they're talking to this leader of the revolution who, the US government is very concerned at the time that he is going to expropriate American land. And so they try to withhold American recognition of Obregón's presidency as a way of trying to get him to create some exceptions in the new policies of the new Mexican Constitution and of his policies to guarantee that Americans can still own land. And he refuses. And so there's this back and forth, and there's this thing called the Bucareli Agreement, which kind of doesn't happen. That is this back and forth between the US and Mexico. And during all of this time, the International Community Welfare League and other Little Liberia folks put together a petition to send to President Harding and Congress to tell them that they should recognize Obregón's presidency, and that they should, and that actually Obregón is a really good example of a president who's doing the work for his people. And so at this time where there's this big, really big standoff between the US and Mexico, they put themselves right in the middle of it and support the Mexican president, who part of the reason he became president is because of the Mexican Revolution.
You mentioned Charlotta Bass in terms
Yes.
of the role of Black women. Anything else to add on that topic?
To be honest, tried really hard to find Black female voices for Little Liberia, and it was really challenging. And part of the reason is at this time, it was very common for social movements to have male leadership. And especially for Black social movements, the expectation was that the leaders who are in the room doing the politicking or who are giving speeches and so forth, kind of the expectation, especially publicly, is that women are involved in the movement, but men are the ones who are doing a lot of the speaking. And part of that is because all the leadership in the U.S. government are male, and a lot of the same is true in Mexico too. And so I suspect that even though there was a lot of women involved in the movement, most of the voices I was able to find were men. And I think that's part of the reason why is most of the sources I have are things that are being published that are meant for consumption. Not to say that there aren't women involved. Obviously, like Charlotta Bass is one of the biggest voices in Black LA in activism at the time, but nationally there's this expectation. That being said, she's a big voice. Also, the write-up that Ebony Magazine did, and I believe it was 1954, talked about Elizabeth Littlejohn, who is James Littlejohn's wife, and talked about how he said she was kind of the main rock for him. She was always by his side with every economic kind of adventure he went on, everything he did, that she was his partner in everything. And so in statements like that, you can really see that in this movement, men and women are working alongside, and you can tell that women in a lot of cases are doing a lot of the grassroots work, are doing a lot of the organizing in Los Angeles and in Oklahoma to really push the conversation. And they're doing a lot of door-to-door work. Even if I'm not saying individual names, it's very clear from a lot of the kind of material that really they're a lot of the foot soldiers and doing a lot of work for it.
Why would Black Angelenos choose Baja California? I mean, were there pull factors and push factors, for example?
Most of it is pull rather than push. So they were very clear that this was not meant to be like a utopian community. They were also very clear that this was not them leaving for good, that they were meaning to stay connected to Los Angeles, move back and forth across the border, and they regularly did. The Littlejohns remained later in life, especially, were elders in their church and came back to Los Angeles for services all the time. And Little Liberia leaders regularly were driving back and forth across, and they had events to try to draw Los Angeles people over. And the reason they did that is because at the time, Baja California and especially Tijuana and Ensenada were seen as tourist destinations. You have Prohibition when it hits, really encourages, we'll say, a lot of Americans to go just across the border to Tijuana for drinking and gambling and lots of other things. And when Tijuana becomes not as tenable, people move further south to Ensenada, which is part of the reason they started looking more into tourism. They mentioned that they thought Baja California and that region of Baja, the Guadalupe Valley, was really ideal because it was just far enough across the border that the border could act as a barrier for racism. They really saw Mexico as a land of opportunity because they saw Mexicans as people who would see them as brothers in a similar cause. There was anti-Blackness in Mexico. There were all kinds of races. There's all versions of racism in Mexico, but it is different than the US. And they saw, and I'm not sure how much they understood of how race worked in Mexico, but they did understand Mexico as somewhere that was opportune. They saw Baja California as an area that was really underutilized economically. And, but they thought the border could be this malleable space where they could have people and goods and ideas crossing but racism really would be stopped. And it didn't make sense for them to go somewhere further into Mexico that wasn't as connected kind of geographically and for transportation. And so they also had a governor who was really kind of favorable to what they were looking for. And so I think for them, the right climate, the right type of land, the financial opportunity, and the social kind of freedom all connected into this really kind of nice, neat package.
You've alluded to the role of the indigenous in this story. Could you elaborate on that?
Yeah, so I really went into this project when I started it like 15 years ago, wanted to find local voices in, especially in Baja California, especially indigenous folks. And sadly, I haven't been able to find as much. The International Community Welfare League mentioned multiple times in some of their materials that they had been connecting to Native American folks in the US. And I think they had that more on their radar because they had leadership from Northeastern Oklahoma. One of the main leaders from that region, J.B. Key, some sources claim he's Afro-Native. Others, it looks like he wasn't. But either way, people in the area clearly identified him as Afro-Native. And a lot of African Americans from that region, given the history of Tulsa and that region of Oklahoma, clearly had indigenous kind of rights, at least in mind at a minimum. And so saw Native Americans as a group that they could connect to. And that petition that they submitted to, or that they were at least attempting to submit to the U.S. government, they mentioned that they had Native Americans from Oklahoma, or I assume from Oklahoma, who had signed. They claimed to have gotten at least 1 million signatures, and that it wasn't just African Americans, and that they had white and indigenous folks who had signed it. So I think they saw them as a group that they could connect to. How much they did is a little unclear.
Well, Laura Hooton of New Mexico State University, author of the book Little Liberia. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
You are listening to Freedom Now on KPFK 90.7 FM. And here's a fundraising update. We did get a $200 donation from Khalil in Los Angeles, who has pledged $200. And Khalil, thank you so much. We want to match that here on Freedom Now. So if there's anyone out there that can match Khalil, that would be incredible. And that would be $400 for KPFK. Khalil pitching in that $200 and you pitching in that $200. Or how about 2 of you pledging that $100? Or 4 of you pledging $50? Or 6 of you pledging $25, $75? That would turn us around right here on KPFK and we'd be able to reach our goal. Our goal on Freedom Now is $1,000. And we are about $600 short of our goal. $700 short of our goal. So, hey, if we can get a last-minute call, if we could get some calls, how about 7 of you rushing to the phone and pledging your support at 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK. And make the difference. We really need to reach our overall goal, which is $200,000. So we're hoping we could really come through today on this Saturday. And by the way, Jennifer Holliday is tonight at Catalina's Bar and Grill. Jennifer Holliday from Dream Girls. I thought I'd throw that in. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. That's the number to call to pledge your support for this radio station that we remain on the air. Freedom Now on every Saturday at 11 a.m., touching on subjects of discrimination, racism, history. It's all here on this program. And you also get a community calendar that lets you know what's happening around the community. That's what public radio is all about, is connecting the community, connecting us together with you. And that's how we overcome. We shall overcome. And that's been the message for decades as those oppressors try to put us down. But we are resilient because we are connected. We are unified together. And they don't like that. They don't want KPFK sending out the message. And they don't want you listening because they don't want you to be knowledgeable about what's going on in the war in Iran, the streets of LA, and ICE, who we denounce. 818-985-5735. You said you were going to arrest all the criminals, not my taco lady, not the father that works hard trying to provide for his family. We didn't agree to that. I didn't sign up for that, and I'm not voting for that. 818-985-5735, but vote for KPFK. Vote that we stay on the air, and call now and let them know that you want this show on the air and you support KPFK. If you called now at 818-985-5735 and said, I love this station, and pledged your support, that would be incredible. How about a one-time caller? How about someone who's never called before? Do it now. This is a tax-deductible charitable donation. You can donate $200, $500, but we do need to make that match from Khalil, who put up $200, and we need to match that. And we're just about $75 short of making that match. 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK. I'm Gary Baca, along with Freedom Now, along with Tej, right here on KPFK. Remember, call now, 818-985-5735, 818-985-KPFK.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Karen Stanford, Professor of Political Science in the Department of Africana Studies at California State University in Northridge, and author of the book with Mark Feltz entitled Marching West, the LA Civil Rights Movement in Photographs. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Karen Stanford.
Thank you for inviting me.
And thank you for accepting the invitation. So why did you produce this book?
Well, as always, I was inspired by my students, most of whom knew very little about the movement, the civil rights movement outside of the South. And then I later discovered in conversations that a broader segment of the population in Los Angeles and Southern California in particular, they weren't aware of the century of Black activism happening in Los Angeles that had occurred for over 100 years. And so I realized that we needed an educational tool so that people understood that the movement occurred right in their cities. And of course, I wanted people to see themselves in that movement so that they could also think about ways in which they can continue the struggle.
So describe what you see as the most provocative images in this book.
Well, you know, it's interesting too. When most people think about the civil rights movement, of course, they think about Selma, they think about Birmingham and Montgomery. They don't think about the images that were very prominent in LA during a certain time period. The images of the of the KKK, very, very provocative. I think that stops people. They're like the KKK, the Ku Klux Klan was here in LA. Well, they weren't just here, they were a staple in Los Angeles for decades, fighting fair housing, for instance, engaging in violence and terrorizing communities. So I think the images of the Ku Klux Klan, the images of the American Nazi Party, I think there's an image in the book of the party actually disrupting a core protest. CORE was protesting housing discrimination, and they just showed up with a big sign, supporting white nationalism. And so those are the images that really take people aback, because I think they're used to looking at images of people marching with signs, but they're not used to seeing images where people are literally fighting the movement outside of the South.
Sorry. Could you elaborate on that latter point with regard to resistance to the civil rights movement in Los Angeles? You mentioned the Klan, the Nazis. Who else would be in this hall of infamy?
Well, obviously the people who ran government institutions and certainly private organizations, the California Real Estate Association resisted any challenge to restrictive housing covenants, which of course prohibited not just Black people, but oftentimes Asians and certainly Jewish people from living in certain areas. And so there were private organizations, nonprofit organizations who were benefiting from that discrimination. And so they were very, very, very difficult challengers for the movement. And actually, it's because of those kinds of groups that Dr. King came to Los Angeles on several occasions to educate people about the work that those groups were doing to continue discrimination. And then also you had government institutions, governmental entities like Mayor Sam Yorty, who was very anti the civil rights movement. He was very disrespectful to some of its leadership, especially the national leadership, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. He refused to release federal funding for poverty programs into the Black community. And so certainly you had governmental entities, and then you had the police chief, in particular, Daryl Gates, who they had a very hostile relationship with the Black community, refused to apologize for the kind of brutality that occurred in Los Angeles again for decades, and refused to apologize for their behavior during the Watts uprising. So there's always been challengers as well as supporters.
So you mentioned the former mayor, Sam Yorty. What about the former mayor, Tom Bradley? Anything to say about him?
Well, Tom Bradley, I would say was the opposite in terms of trying to build multicultural coalitions, trying to work with other groups, acknowledge their own struggles, their pains, and also some of their wins. They were just on the opposite side. Tom Bradley was a former police officer who eventually became a city councilman, and he was eventually elected the first Black mayor, but he had to overcome Sam Yorty's race baiting and racist statements and comments in his attempt to defeat Tom Bradley, but he was unable to do so.
What role, if any, do celebrities play in this book?
Wow, that's a really interesting question, and I think it's what makes the movement in LA so distinct from others. LA is a company town, and the company is entertainment. And so because of the resources, the fact that many of the nation's most visible, well-paid entertainers were from LA, and these were entertainers often who were just as disgusted with racism and discrimination, especially what was happening in their own industries, that they were able to draw attention to the movement, and they were able to fund the movement. One of the reasons why Dr. King founded an organization on the ground here in Los Angeles. It was called the Western Christian Leadership Conference. And it was founded primarily for fundraising purposes, because that's where they could get the money they needed to help sustain the campaigns in the South. I mean, the bail bondsmen in the South would not bail people out of jail, but we had a bail bondsman in LA who bailed out hundreds of people in the South, because not only did he have the resources, but he had the relationships, and he didn't have the fear that many of the local bail bondsmen had. So in terms of funding, I know that the Montgomery bus boycott, which began in 1955, received their first check from Los Angeles organizers 2 months later. And they continued to receive those checks because it was LA that was sustaining the movement with resources, media as well as funds, and on the ground organizing.
So are we talking about Sammy Davis Jr., Sidney Poitier, Marlon Brando, others?
Absolutely. We're definitely talking about them. We're talking about, Rita Moreno. I mean, and that's another sort of distinction in terms of the civil rights movement in LA, because it's such a multiracial and diverse city that, you know, Italians, Jewish people worked together with Black people. They were fighting their own struggles, but they also wanted to defeat racism and discrimination. And so a plethora of entertainers held fundraisers at their homes, like Burt Lancaster. They were very much involved with chartering the planes. That's another distinction as well in LA, is that when Los Angeles activists traveled to the South, many of them traveled in chartered planes rather than on buses. And that was because of the wealth here. The beauty is that those entertainers in that industry, most of them stepped up to support it, when obviously in other places there wasn't that kind of support.
Mm-hmm. What about the organized formations, such as you mentioned CORE, the Congress of Racial Equality, NAACP perhaps? Were there others, and what roles did they play?
You know, the NAACP was the leading organization in Los Angeles during the Civil Rights era, as well as, of course, you had the churches, Second Baptist Church, First AME Church. But NAACP was one of the strongest, not just, it wasn't strong, in California, but also in the nation. And that, again, was because you had people like Sammy Davis Jr., who was serving as the honorary membership chair, with Marnez Bataket, who was a fierce leader in her own right. And so the NAACP led many of the major lawsuits that outlawed things like restrictive covenant at the national level. And then you had CORE, very, very well-respected branches of CORE, primarily made up of students for a long time, who helped to defeat housing discrimination. And they helped to defeat just, the issue of Black people in grooming and getting haircuts. Black people were barred in LA from going to certain barbershops. And it was CORE that stepped in and made sure that those laws were changed and those practices were changed. There was a chapter of SNCC in Los Angeles. It's an interesting story because SNCC became a paramilitary organization on the ground. Unlike CORE, many of those organizations were nonviolent, but because of the harassment, SNCC members armed themselves. They had very contentious relationships with the police. There was the CAP, the Coalition Against Police Brutality. This was a group that monitored and followed the cops and police officers to make sure that people who were stopped or people who were contacted by them were treated fairly. And they had such a contentious relationship with the not just governmental institutions, but certainly the police, that, I mean, their phones were bugged all the time. I mean, they had to literally ensure their own protection because of the tactics that they engaged in. But remember, not only did you have Watts, you had the incident with the Deadweiler family, where you had this young man driving his pregnant wife to the hospital, and a cop stops him and then leans over in the car and shoots him. Johnny Cochran becomes the attorney, one of his first major cases in 1966. So there's always a contentious relationship with those organizations, but the Black community stepped up and organized in full force, to challenge what was happening.
So you mentioned SNCC, ostensibly grounded in the student community. Anything else to add about the role of students during this period?
Oh my gosh, yes. The students were magnificent. And what I'm hoping is that when students today learn of the kind of work that they did in the 50s and the 60s, that they will pick up that mantle. Wow, UCLA, Los Angeles City County, Santa Monica College. I mean, their students were they primarily made up the bulk of core, and then later SNCC. But the students were they led the Freedom Rides from Los Angeles. I think we had there's documented about 430 Freedom Riders thus far in the country, and Los Angeles sent at least 6 or 7 contingents of 10 or more people. So, and they, of course, received the kind of support and funding from the churches and from the entertainment community that allowed them to get on those buses and travel to the South, and of course get arrested, and then come back and tell their stories.
Finally, Karen Stanford, professor at California State University at Northridge, author of the book Marching West. What about women activists? Anything to add about that?
You know, women in Los Angeles were front and center. They powerhouses, to say the least. Charlotta Bass, who is a publisher of the California Eagle, I would say she led the movement through her newspaper. She put people on the ground to document the experiences of Black people, and also to talk about the wins, the challenges. She used her newspaper as a weapon against discrimination. They wielded cameras to show pictures that you would never see in the LA Times and the mainstream press. So Charlotta Bass was a very, very important figure. You also had Gwendolyn Green, who was an activist and a member of the NAACP in Colorado. She comes to LA and she becomes an activist, and then before you know it, she's head of the executive director of the Western Christian Leadership Conference. So she is a woman heading that organization that was primarily dominated by Black male clergy. And then Dr. King beckons her to go to Atlanta to lead a voter registration drive that lasted for 6 months. So she literally uprooted herself and moved to Atlanta to lead that organization. I mean, and that's, education in LA, even though it was lacking in certain areas, and the migrant culture, Black people coming from other spaces, they had that quote unquote immigrant mentality in terms of we're going to make it or bust. They came oftentimes as educated people, and they knew how to navigate systems. And so Gwendolyn Green was one of those individuals, and actually she was, I guess, one of our primary sources for uncovering the movement here in Los Angeles. And then you had Marnez Bataket, who was the head of the NAACP membership drive, who invited Rosa Parks here. So Rosa Parks comes to LA like in 1956, a few months after the bus boycott began. And so, and again, these are people who had relatives in the South. The Pullman porters were carrying the messages to Black people throughout the country. So there was a great network of folks, but women were definitely not absent in terms of leadership.
Well, Karen Stanford, I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much for inviting me.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guests, Professors Laura Hooton and Karen Stanford from New Mexico State University and Cal State Northridge, respectively. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Much love to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder, Baba Didan Kamathi. Shout out to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. This station is an essential resource in your life. Whether it's reliable information you can use or joyful music that inspires your community, this station provides you with programming that you rely on. You are an essential part of this station too. Listeners provide the funding that keeps the news, information, and arts alive. Listeners' money fuels the station's power to operate. So if you're going to continue to count on this station, please remember its staff and volunteers count on you. Your contribution this hour enables this essential resource to provide vibrant radio. Here is how you can help. To make a pledge, call 818-985-5735. That's 818-985-KPFK. Or go online to kpfk.org. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org or go to our audio archives at kpfk.org. Scroll down to Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. And until next Saturday here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.